Okay. Hello, everybody. Happy to be here. I'm just drinking my second coffee so that I go over the threshold. This is my leaky integrator. I'm from Tufts. Today, I'm going to just share with you some of my perspective on collective mechanical intelligence. I'll talk about what that means. To start, I was really trained as a, applied mathematician, fluid mechanicist, but then I found myself, looking at animals and robots, and in particular, the similarities and differences between them, and also comparing them, very importantly, to agent-based models, the sort of the mathematical tools that we have for understanding these collective systems. And there are two things I'm really fascinated by. The first thing is that, strength in numbers applies for both biological systems and robotic systems. If you have an individual robot, you cannot do much. But if you have a ton, you can start to form different shapes, and you see all these different examples in real life where, as a collective, you can form these wholes that are greater than some of its parts. Examples include cells. I don't know why I'm hearing echoes here. I'm just going to push this away. So epithelial cell is a great example of, collective behavior that is really reliant on mechanical forces. So whenever you have a cut in your skin, this is how your cells are being pushed by each other to sort of form and fill the gaps that's left behind. Ants, obviously, they cannot cross a gap this wide because it's way wider than individual ants, but as a collective, they can form these bridges that helps them to do that. The other example that I really, really loved that I actually studied in more depth in my PhD is looking at the ant raft. This is moving a little too fast because it's on Zoom, but let's see if we can play that ant video again. But these are really fascinating. This is really loud because this is on Zoom, so this is a little different. But you can see this raft, I guess, being pushed around by the fish underneath. So these structures that they built as a collective are very, very robust to different mechanical disturbances. And this is what I will talk a little more about a little later. But microscopically, when you think about collective behavior, you think about fish schools, bird flocks. These are really, really microscopic systems that sort of come together and deform as they're being, attacked by the predator, and so on and so forth. So really intrigued by them. And sort of parallelly, there are also these research thinking about how robots are better as a collective. And one of the most sort of intriguing example are sort of these drone swarms, because, as a swarm, if you can have a lot of smaller individuals, then it's easier for you to navigate through a very cluttered environment. So say, a fire scenes, for example, if you have building collapsed, it's very hard to have a very heavy and the big drone that flies through, and it's oftentimes easier to have smaller drones flying through the corridors and then maybe collaborate with each other to lift up something in the fire scenes. However,
those drones are pairwise talking to each other or to everybody?
Yep, yeah, pairwise, yeah. So the things I'm really interested in, the biology domain, really looking at different ecosystems, because these are ecosystems that are very, very rich in biodiversity and are also potentially going through some changes. So mangrove forest, kelp forest, and coral reef. And one thing that you can immediately appreciate just by looking at them is that they're all very cluttered environments. So pretty much like the bamboo forest that you just saw, these are very crowded environment. And these poses a challenge for the current ROV system. So the current sort of underwater autonomous or non-autonomous robots are oftentimes these bulky ones. So these are the fleet carried by MBARI, the Monterey Bay Aquarium Research Institute. These are all very big, so they're very, very fit for going to the depth of the ocean and do some ocean sampling. However, these could be very challenging to sort of navigate in these ecosystems that we really need to be monitoring. So that's one axis. The other axis that I'm very intrigued by is mechanical intelligence, and this also applies to both biological systems and robots. And this, the idea of mechanical intelligence sort of emerged from broadly sort of the soft robotics community, thinking about when you have robots, maybe instead of building a very, very rigid arm, you can have these inflatable different devices or hydraulic devices that either can form grippers or actuator or different kind of system where you essentially offload some of the control to the softness, to the mechanical intelligence of your robot. And so I'm really thinking about ways that both biological systems and robots can maybe utilizing both mechanical intelligence and strength in numbers, and looking at how you can have collectives that utilize mechanical intelligence and mechanical interaction so that they're energy efficient, they're adaptive, as well as achieving some passive control without actively doing some PID control of your systems. Okay, I guess before I jump into what I want to talk about, this is just a portfolio of what I've studied so far along these two axes. So I studied the biomechanics of individual organisms, so from C elegans to E. coli. I looked at robot swarms that are not mechanically smart, but they achieve things just by wirelessly talking to each other. Along the mechanical intelligent axes, I've been collaborating with Saab Mamla and other people on springtail jumping, thinking about how the compliance of the springtail actually helps them to do a lot of passive control. So along the mechanical intelligence axes, but doesn't have much collective intelligence. But of course, I'm most excited about the things on the top right. So I've worked on black soldier fly larvae. So these are maggots, and we're doing fluidization experiments, thinking about when you sort of just provide airflow at the bottom of these gigantic collective, how do they, actively maneuver around, and how can they achieve sort of the collective mechanical intelligence. So this is the fire ant raft example. I won't go into depth about this particular project, but this is a top view looking at a fire ant raft, the raft that I just showed you. But here there's a flow coming from the bottom of the screen. So there's a top view looking at the raft, but flow come from underneath. And you can see this raft sort of mechanically intelligently sort of deform into this airflow shape to reduce drag. And some other examples I'll talk in more depth about. I also have a fun corner of my research. So I've looked at traffic flow, looking at how the changed lane behavior is perhaps analogous to the viscosity in traffic flow. So a lot of people like to model traffic flow in terms of fluid mechanics, and that is an analogy that is very intriguing, and I published a paper on that. I also looked at the physics of walk tossing, so looking at the kinematics of walk tossing and how this motion can exactly lead to the takeoff the rice grain, as well as being able to catch it in the next cycle. This is the kind of ongoing project looking at the dead fish vibing in a flow. So this fish that you see here is a dead fish. This was a paper around 10 years ago that was pretty popular about how dead fish was vibing. There, they didn't look at a lot of different species, and I really want to look at the effect of stiffness, the flow speed, the obstacle size, and all that. So I did another sort of comprehensive study that is now in press. Okay. Today, I realized there's some lag here. Today, I'll talk about two main systems. I'll talk about fire ant rafts again, and this is more of a satisfying story, I would say, from a mathematical perspective, because things really come together nicely. And then I'll talk about fish schools, which is sort of still an ongoing direction because of a lot of the different challenges that I run into that hopefully you'll appreciate. Okay, so first, fire ants. These are Solenopsis invicta, the fire ants that were native to Brazilian forest. And now they're invasive species. So all these red dots, literally throughout the tropical regions of the world, you can find them. They're literally everywhere. And one of their superpower is to form rafts. So this is the sort of side view of this raft standing on top of a water surface. And again, the raft is purely consists of their own bodies. They don't bring any branches or any other materials on it. It's literally just by holding hands that they can form these rafts. And sort of the evolutionary reason that they have to do this is because the Amazon forest where they're from are subject to flooding seasons. And so the ants over there develop different strategies to survive these flooding seasons. Some become almost like water strider. They have long legs. They become very good individual swimmers. So when the water floods above the ground, they can navigate that way. Fire ants, they're small, and so they don't actually swim very well. So this is their survival strategy. They can literally form these rafts that float on a water surface for weeks or even months, where with their queen, their broods, everybody's on board until sort of the flood recedes. And like it's shown, there are different kind of fluid forces that are pushing them around, but the structure is relatively stable. And this is the video that really intrigued me as when I started my PhD, looking at, fire ants bringing this, paper strip back to their nest. And the reason that they did that was because the paper strip had the queen pheromone. So they mistake that paper strip as their queen, and they were like, we need to protect our queen. So they end up bringing this paper strip back to their nest. And the reason that this was really, really intriguing for me was because even then I was thinking a lot about VCheck model, Boyce model, all these models of collective behavior, about how agents would sense each other and make out, where they are and make their own decision based on that. But ants, they actually don't sense neighbors very far away. They really rely on these local interactions, because that doesn't look like a queen at all. But this is something that's not so intuitive as a human, because we rely on vision a lot. But vision is really one of the superpower that allows you to sense a neighbor a lot of body lengths away, right? Ants don't have that superpower. So the question is, this obviously doesn't obey VCheck and all these different models. How can they sense each other at all on a water surface, right? To form a raft, presumably they need to sense the presence of each other. We know that they rely a lot on pheromone. Professor Gordon already talked about, we don't know much about what pheromones are there. There's oil-based and water-based. We don't know how these pheromones actually transport on the water surface. So we don't know how effective they are. We don't know if they know each other's presence at all on the water surface. If they don't, how can they assemble without the knowledge of each other? What is the role of mechanics in that process? So fortunately, Georgia Tech, where I did my PhD, was one of those littered zones. So we literally have all these ant mounds on campus, can dig them up, bring them back to the lab, and do some experiments. And so the way we do the experiment is as follows. So we put all these ants into the beaker. So we only put the worker ants. We don't want queens in that. And then we roll them into a ball, and then we just dump the ball on the water surface. And so the ball of ant will quickly expand from a ball shape to a sort of pancake 2D plane. And so that's how we make our raft. And so we want to sort of play with the size and see how the raft's ability scale with sizes. And typically when we have 100 ants, the ant colonies in fire ants, they usually have, just thousands and thousands of ants. So 100 ants is relatively small already, but dump the ball on the water surface and expand into this 2D pancake that's relatively stable. But as you decrease the number of ants gradually, you start to get into the regime where you follow the same protocol. So the ant raft or ant ball actually started at in a very dense aggregate. But once it touches the water, it actually explodes. So this is kind of the first observation that, ant rafts, the fire ant rafts are actually not stable all the time. And actually it depends on the size and the number of ants. This is not the most unstable case, but you see that it sort of fracture into multiple smaller rafts. So you're wondering about what is the mechanism of disassembly and what is the mechanism behind this transition from stable to unstable.
Just wondering what's up with the size differences, or are they just different?
Yeah, they have different sizes in their colony. Is there a question in the back? Okay. Okay, so like a physicist or a mathematician would, you start to do pairwise interaction with them. And that's when even more weird things start to happen. So if you just put a pair of ants on a water surface, what you'll find is that, instead of actively going towards each other and hold hands like all these agent-based models would predict, they actually kick each other out of the way. So they don't seem to recognize each other's presence again, and their random movement actually a lot of times they end up pushing their neighbors out of the way. But in other sort of scenarios, they actually get attracted to each other, but they're sort of passively drawn into each other. So in this video, they seem to be almost trying to get away from each other, but the passive sort of Cheerios effect actually attract them together. And the Cheerios effect is named after, what happens on your Cheerio bowl whenever you have something that's sitting on your water surface. And if they're at the right sort of size range and hydrophobicity range, then they have this tendency to attract to each other. So ants, the fire ants, seems to be just in the right sort of density and phobicity that they are attracted to each other. And potentially this is what actually leads to the assembly of fire ant raft. So to sort of prove or to probe this hypothesis, what we did is we find a mechanical model of fire ant raft self-assembly. So this is kind of the Landrum model where you have F equals to ma and all the things on the right-hand side are sort of the active propulsion term. So this is the noise term, the drag term, so a force that's proportional to the velocity, as well as the pairwise interaction term. So this is just the capillary attraction, the Chereos effect between two individuals. And the last one is just the collision. When they're getting too close, you need that expulsion.
1D or 2D?
2D. So these are 2D disk circles. Okay. But the thing here to note is all these forces are mechanical. So this is, again, in contrast with the agent-based model where I say that I'm sensing something actively in the field and I'm doing anything actively. Here, we're basically modeling the activity of N as just the random Brownian force that's moving around, and all these other forces are mechanical.
Sorry to be dense, but if FC is a vector and it's only dependent on the scalar distance, how does it know which direction to apply that force?
Which one?
Well, you have FC of Dij. I assume Dij is a distance between neighbors.
Yep.
But what defines its direction?
The direction is along the direction of the distance.
J, I guess, not just Dij.
Yeah. Yeah. So how strong are these forces? Yeah, I guess Dij is a vector. Yeah. Because we have the answer, we can actually do experiments with these. And the way that we do experiments one by one is by sort of conceptually muting the terms in our model. So if you just do one N experiment, obviously no pairwise interaction, and all you get is the rest of the term. So basically you measure the Brownian walk of an end, and you can get the statistics that will give you a characterization of the Ka. You can also do experiments with a dead end. So effectively, you also mute out the activity term, and all you get is the drag term. So indeed, this is a macroscopic system. So if you push the end, it's going to coast a little until it comes to a complete stop. And you can use the time scale to get an estimate of the Kf.
Is eta white noise, or do you
Yes,
have time
white
scale?
noise. White
You
noise.
don't have a time scale.
No.
But there could be a time scale, some persistence time scale.
There could be. And I mean, the white noise is applied at the acceleration level. So the velocity would have a color.
Oh,
That makes sense. Yeah. And if you want to.
Not to be too dense, but in principle, the drag could be different when the ant is alive and kind of on the feet versus, I don't know, resting on the side.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, this is just the simplest model because we totally could have modeled activity as a function of a lot of different things, right? So this is just a zero order model and want to see how well it captured the stability transition. The capillary attraction, again, we can also measure because we have these ants. We just kill them. So they don't have active propulsion anymore. These have drag, they have the capillary attraction, and you can measure how fast they come together and really extract these coefficients. So obviously, I write this equation in a very, very simplified way, but what I really want to highlight is that they're all obviously characterized by these coefficients, and all these coefficients are the ones that we can actually measure with different experiments. And this is what the simulations will come out to be. So if you just put in the coefficients that we measure, you'll find again that the smaller raft indeed is not stable because the active propulsion, the random walk, is too much, that the Chereos effect is not enough to attract it together. Whereas if you have a larger raft, say you have 13, then you have a bigger attraction base, and therefore even if they're still having the same amount of Brownian motion, but they can still form this stabilized raft. And we can compare these two experiments, but these model already show that fire ants really take advantage of this passive Chereo fluid forces for self-assembly. And this is also a very intriguing example for me that collective behavior sometimes can be using passive forces and not actively assembled.
What is the physical origin of the Chereos effect?
Capillary attraction.
Capillary.
Yeah.
And is there any relation of this to motility-induced phase separation?
The connection is not very clear there. Yeah, because motility base is based on motility and the fact that if you get into a crowded area, you slow down, right? But this one, the velocity there's no feedback between velocity and the local density at all.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so the feedback is not there. But yeah, we did do some, phase separation related experiments where you can, because, in simulation, we can play with the model and say, what if we have more activity? What if we have less activity? What if we start with the, equally spaced initial condition? In certain cases, they do sort of form clusters. Yeah. But this is interesting because all these forces are mechanical. So that means that we can design mechanical systems that will also cluster using the same way. And this also suggests that maybe beyond fire ants, maybe there are other biological species that also can aggregate using the same mechanism as long as they're in the same density range, the same hydrophobicity range. And this is sort of an ongoing research that we're going looking at the snow springtails, which are not a species of springtails. They normally just sit on the water surface, but they actually also aggregate into these rafts that are actively being destroyed because these springtails, they jump off of the water surface, so they actually can have the potential to destroy the raft as well. But they seem to be also pulled together by this shear effect, suggesting that this sort of passive assembly mechanism is pretty common in biological organisms. So this is the first story I want to say. The second part is about fish schools and how they may be utilizing some mechanical intelligence in their self-assembly. So this sort of curiosity start with this very fascinating video of a dead trout undulating a vortex sheet. So in this video, water comes from the left. This is the top view. There's a D-shaped cylinders there that are just creating vortices that are hitting this dead trout left and right. And you see that in this experiment, the dead trout seems to be able to undulate passively, just according to the vortices that's hitting it, and even be able to locomote upstream. So this suggests to me that hydrodynamic interaction is obviously very important. When you think about the fish schools, you think about all the vortices that are being generated by the leaders, and the follower fish are going to be hit by all the vortices from the leader as well. And there are also other evidence about living fish may be matching their vortices to save energy as well. And of course, the most famous sort of hypothesis of fish school formation is that they're going to form these diamond shape. And all these hypotheses are based on the fact that there's very intense hydrodynamic interaction that are coupling all these agents, and by forming a particular shape, they can save energy. This is sort of the more modern version of this, where the experimenter put two hydrofoils in line. So this is the leader. It's flapping there, and you can put basically follower in different locations. And this is because this dynamics is obviously very complex, but if you have two that are in phase, then you can start to do a parameter sweep of the follower location. And what you find is that a lot of the follower locations are actually not stable, right? So if you untether a follower that's flapping here, and if you just let go and don't give it any forces at all, it cannot act, it doesn't have to stay there, right? It will be pushed by the fluid forces left and right. So not all formations that fish occupy is stable. And this is just very important thing to keep in mind that maybe speaks to some of the organization of the fish schools. But one thing that we know, so this is another piece of indirect evidence, is that fish school does save energy, and the energy saving seems to be dependent on speed. So on the left plot, this is showing how individual is spending way more energy than a school. And recently, we also did another experiments with fish not only swim in different speeds, but also in different flow conditions. So we swim them in turbulence and in laminar flows. And what you see is that in particular, in this turbulent condition, individual fish spend way more energy compared to swimming in school. And the idea that in the turbulent flow, being the school is particularly helpful because potentially your leaders filter some of the turbulent structure out, and the follower can benefit more in this sort of unstructured environment.
How do you measure the energy?
So this is through oxygen consumption. So we measure the oxygen concentration in the water before and after experiments, and we do but this also points to the fact that mechanics matters a lot. The environment, sort of the ecology of collective behavior, the physical environment matters a lot in their energy saving properties. Okay. And one thing that really bothers me when I go into this research is, I really want to do a lot of modeling. I really want to do a lot of cool stuff, but I realize there's not really a lot of data. And one actually big gap is we don't actually know what fish school likes to form in 3D. So when you give fish all these freedom to go in 3D, we don't know what kind of formations they prefer. So I decided to jump into this first thing, which is to figure out what formations they like in 3D. So that's when I started my collaboration with George, who's going to talk a little later, looking at these giant danios. And we can only look at 6 of them, because if there are too many, then it's hard to get really crowded, which I'm sure a lot of the animal tracking people would appreciate. But we were able to do these experiments using sleep, one of the motionless tracking algorithm, and to really extract the formation of fish school in 3D over 10 hours at a time. So we're just streaming the videos into our SSD and then extract their formation over a very, very long time scale. So we have very, very long, lot of statistics in this. And what we found is fish prefer a ladder formation in 3D, and I'll walk you through what that formation looked like. So this is the top view. So if you have a fish that's centered at the middle, and the probability distribution around it is showing, where is the most likely for you to find a neighbor next to this central focused fish. And you see that it's more likely than not to find a fish in front of you and also behind you. But notice that this map is to scale, so the fish seems to be a little overlapping. And that's because if you look at the side view, they're actually not in the same plane. So from the side view, if you have a fish that's in front of you, more likely than not, the fish is below you. And if you have a fish behind you, then that fish will be above you. So this is what we call a ladder formation. This is a new formation that we found by doing this experiment. And I'll jump through some of the more sort of rigorous characterization of the pairwise position in the polar coordinate. And you see that the diamond formation that is hypothesized to be the most common actually showed up very little in our probability map. And our ladder formation really occupies 79% of the pairwise positions. And incidentally, this is them in ladder formation in real life. I just took a random photo at the beginning of the experiment, and I went back because these analyses take forever. You have to, train the neural network and do machine learning. And after I did all analysis, I looked back at the photo. This is exactly the photo of, the fish and these sort of vertically staggered ladder formation. And the other thing we found by looking at these 10-hour-long experiments is that we look at how the school length is changed by the flow speed. So because we can play with the flow speed that's coming at them. And if you have a very high flow speed, then the fish would have to keep up with the flow speed. And what we found is that the school length also increases with the flow speed. And at very, very low speed, your vertical stagger is not as staggered, is almost vertically stacked. But as you increase the flow speed, you start to stagger more and more, and you can see almost the formation being sheared more and more as you increase the flow speed here.
Hey, can I ask a quick question? So
Yeah.
when you change the speed, do the fish kind of match their movement to be more or less stationary in this
Mhm.
little?
Yep. Yeah. Because otherwise they'll just be pushed to the back of the flow tank and they'll hurt. Yeah.
Do they jockey for position? Is one of these thought to be more efficient than the others in terms of?
Yeah, so this is another huge open question that we need, a lot of analysis to do, because, CFD with 3 fish that are freely moving is not that easy. But we do have a hypothesis I'll get to. But before that, I'll talk about, I'll just mention that we also find, like as, sort of alluded to at the beginning, that rafts, the firearm raft also elongates under fluid flow, potentially to save drag. But coming back to the hypothesis of why they would, find a formation like this and why this would be beneficial, we want to go back to the diamond formation argument. Why a diamond was thought to be helpful was because this is actually, what you would need to think about when you think about the flow created by a fish. A fish really swims by creating a jet. So this highlighted region, they swim by, on average, creating a jet going behind. And so being in line, being right behind another fish is always inefficient because you don't want to be in the jet in front of a neighbor. The second argument of the diamond formation is that the fish, if they're perfectly synchronized, then they can save energy. But being vertically staggered, fish also benefit from avoiding the leader's jet because you're staggered. You don't get the benefit of being perfectly synchronized and exploding the vortices per se, but it also relieved the requirement of synchronizing with one another. So we think that this is why, this is a way for the fish school to improve efficiency without having to synchronizing their tail with their leaders, because very easily you can think of a cascading effect. If I want to synchronize my tail with my leader, but my leader is trying to synchronize the tail with another person, then the synchronization all of a sudden becomes almost impossible. And we think that's why fish prefer this formation that is both hydrodynamic efficient and also sort of in a control sense more realistic. I don't know how much time I have. 10 minutes? Okay. I'll just touch on some of the robotic work that I've done in this space, particularly because doing the simulations and doing for the hydrodynamics coupled with agent-based simulation has been pretty challenging. And so I'm like, what if we just do a robot? Because the fluid in real life will definitely obey Navier-Stokes without any problem. And so I went on this other rabbit hole of designing a fish-like robot. It's around 10 centimeters long, so it's quite small, but it swims at 2.7 body lengths per second. It's relatively simple because I want to eventually build into a swarm. So the eventual goal of building this platform is I want to build a swarm of these fish robots so that they are either passively or actively interacting with each other hydrodynamically, and see if a particular formation would emerge just from passive flapping. So it's simple by design, and the actuator is really the backbone of this fish. Is a magnet in coil actuator. So the sort of the flapper has a permanent magnet in it that's sitting within a coil that we can control with Arduino. And so by sending a current through your coil one way, you generate magnetic field one way and the flippers go one way. But if you flip the direction of the current and therefore the magnetic field, the flapper goes the other way. So you can really control the flapping through controlling the direction of the current. So we learned a bunch of things about both robots and biology and fluid mechanics this way. The first thing we do is we actually attach the whole thing on a stick and measure the forces acting on it. So we found that this blue guppy, that we call it, the fish robot, produces thrust in all flow speeds. So the top is the thrust versus flow speed, and the bottom is the drag versus flow speed. So the drag versus flow speed is pretty typical. So it's scaled with the velocity square, and the thrust decreases a little bit with the flow speed. And the condition that we really want to make sure that we hit is the condition where the thrust and drag sort of balances out each other. And so to the left-hand side, if the flow speed is slower than that, you have a net thrust producing fish. If you have flow speed even higher, then you have a net drag producing fish. So on the left-hand side of this, if you let the tether go, the fish would go forward because the flow speed is a little slower. And on the right-hand side, if you remove the tether, then the fish would trail behind because the thrust it is producing is not as much as the drag that's coming at it. We also did sort of the PIV looking at the flow field generated by these fish. So these are sort of the vortices that are being shed, and blue and red are the different direction of the vortices. But you can immediately appreciate that in all these conditions, it sort of generated these bifurcating jet, and sort of the bifurcation and the angle of the jet decreases as the flow speed increases. So that's going to the right. There's a very easy model that we came up with that helps us understand why the jet angle decreases, and that's through just looking at the velocity scales in different directions. So in the span-wise direction, the velocity is characterized by the frequency multiplied by amplitude. So that characterizes how fast the fluid is being flicked back and forth span-wise. Stream-wise is the incoming flow velocity that sets the velocity scale. So the angle would scale with sort of the ratio between the sort of the span-wise velocity and the stream-wise velocity, and the ratio of them is actually exactly Schuhel number. So if you plot out the Schuhel number, so the ratio between these two, you'll find that Schuhel number also decreases as the flow increases, and sort of qualitatively, this very simple argument actually captures well why the angle decreases. However, the angle actually never goes to zero. And if we look at the free-swimming fish, both the biological organism and also the robot, when you just let go of the tether, it actually sheds a unified jet going backwards. So this is something that we found, which sort of points to actually having the fish free swim produces a very different vortical structure than having a fish tether to something. Because when you tether this fish to something, there's always some torque that's transmitted through the tether, and that results in the bifurcating of the jet. The other thing that we tried was to look at the turning of the fish. So because we are changing the current in order to change the flapping, we can actually change the temporal bias. So we can say that we want our fish tail to be on the right for T1 and then be on the left for T2, and T1 and T2 doesn't have to equal to each other. If you do that, you can introduce essentially a temporal bias, the ratio between the time on the right and on the left. And what you can find is that, in this robotic system, at least, without any bias, the fish swims very, very fast in a straight line. But if you encode some temporal bias, you can actually get the fish to turn. And as you increase the bias even more, you can get the fish to turn in a smaller and smaller circle. I don't know if we have time to go through all the math here, but we also did some analysis in terms of the mechanism of turning. So if you look at the orientational velocity of the straight line swimming, so that's on the left, you have a very nice and balanced symmetrical plot of your fish being in positive orientational velocity versus in a negative orientational velocity. But as a turn, if you have this temporal bias, you have T1 and T2 not equal to each other, you start to have asymmetric flapping, and really the peak of your orientational velocity is the same regardless of what kind of control you do. The difference actually comes from the in-between, where you essentially hold your fin on one side very, very temporarily as a rudder, and then that is essentially enough to cause the turning. And we can collapse the data this way by plotting the curvature, which is almost a non-dimensional quantity, versus this bias, which is also non-dimensional quantity, and you can see that they align very well here. Okay. Maybe skip through some of these stuff. But essentially what we found through just coming up with this robotic platform is that, we have a robot now that is very small, very easy to make, relatively fast, and we have a very good way to control its speed and as well as turning, and we can, just basically tune the frequency and bias for them to basically do whatever you want. But the real reason that I want to do this, the real reason I went down this rabbit hole, is I want to be able to see how a swarm behaves. So that's actually the ongoing direction. I hope that I'll have more results later. But this is sort of the ongoing work, looking at a school of these fish-like robots, and you can see this sort of shadow graph method helps us also visualize the vortices being shed. So these shadow that's trailing behind these fish, this actually corresponds to the vortices that you're creating. So really, with these unique platform, I want to sort of probe how, when you have a school of these fish robots, they can interact with each other. So look at the hydrodynamics of these schools in formation. We can sort of replicate. Yeah, we can, but in this case, they're not, because it only has one actuator. So you need additional actuator, or if you understand the dynamics very well, to traverse in 3D. Yeah.
You still don't have.
No. Yeah, it's complicated. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, I'm happy to talk more. Yeah, but if you give it some pitch, then it can traverse in 3D if you control it well. To understand the collective dynamics and maneuvers. And to sort of understand the self-organizing principles of aquatic swarms. Okay, so today I kind of talked about sort of two different scenarios. So, for the firing case, I feel like there's a little better closure because, there's a math model and everything worked well. For the fish school, as I went into there, I found that there's not enough data about fish school formation. So I went into that first rabbit hole, and I figured that it's also very hard to really control the fish to do what you want them to do, or simulate them in different formation. So I went to a different rabbit hole of just building robots, and because these robots will do what they do. And now I have this swarm of robot that potentially can follow different formations that fish do and look at how they're being pushed by the fluid interactions. But of course, the mechanical collective intelligence perspective is not new, because this is, all, biological matter has been thinking is, if you have these collective as a matter, how they physically interact with each other. So you can do experiments with fire ants like this and think of them as viscoelastic fluids, or you can do experiments with these maggots and just tilt them back and forth and sort of compare them to viscous fluids. However, what I realize is the sort of the active matter community, which I really love, haven't looked at macroscopic domain as much. So a lot of us really want to use fish schools and bird flocks as an opening, sort of motivating examples of active matter. But really, in the marsh beanies, this is one of the examples. When you just look at all the talks that happen, only 1 out of 55 talks are in microscopic domains. Most of the talks are in bacteria, active matter, and only 12 out of 38 in collective matter, and 4 are on fire ants. So I really think there's a very promising and interesting space to look at active matter and the mechanical interaction of these collectives in microscopic space. In particular, in fluid media, because we know that the scale matters a lot, right? As a applied mathematician, you want to think about, if I have agent-based models, and if I have them, embedded in these sort of fluid network, in low Reynolds number, we can have dipole-dipole interaction, all these, simpler interaction, but in high Reynolds number, there will be shedding vortices, and the interaction between agents now become non-reciprocal. And there are all these fun but messy things that's gonna, happen. But these are very real. These are very real sort of mechanical interaction that dictates how insects to fish self-organize. So this is kind of the thing I'm really excited about finding out. And so idea that filling the gap and thinking about adding mechanics to the models of swarms, so going beyond the VCheck type of agent-based model that basically tell agents where to go based on where their neighbors are. So essentially, the model goes from the neighbor states to the locomotion, and filling in the gap and thinking about how they're locally disturbing their fluid environment and how the fluid environment is affecting their movement. In particular, why this is important, because both sensing and actuation is not something that's taken for granted for both biological organisms and robots. So actually, when you think about the fire ant example, and this happens for some of our robots too, our fire ants actually cannot use VCheck model to self-organize because they cannot even sense each other, and they're also not very good swimmers. So you really need to fill in these mechanics gap in order to have a comprehensive model that can actually describe biological organisms. And you also need to fill in this gap in order for our robot swarms to be able to self-organize in that way, because they can't necessarily sense neighbors too far away depending on what kind of sensors you have on board. So that leads to sort of this sort of fluid synergy framework, looking at how fish schools essentially can sort of coordinate with each other potentially through passive interaction, so similar to what fire ants would, as well as perhaps through some active sort of fluid-mediated communication. So fish schools in the dark, they can also form these coherent structure, but they really cannot see each other in the dark, of course. So potentially they would have to sense the vortices being generated by their leaders in order to form these self-organizations. So there's also an added opportunity for fluid-mediated communications. Okay, so that is the end of my talk. I think I'm right on time. With that, I'd like to thank all my collaborators. So a lot of my PhD work was done with David Hu at Georgia Tech, and my postdoc was with Hungtang Ko, my other rabbit hole, looking at fish robots. I'd like to thank all my collaborators and funding agencies. And with that, I'd like to take any questions you have.